Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to address the committee. There's two issues I want to talk about. First, I'd like to address the role of the White House in policy-relevant research performed by government employees, which this committee is obviously concerned with today. As a NASA employee performing climate change research during the Clinton-Gore administration, I was told what I could and could not say during congressional testimony. Since it was well known that I was skeptical of the view that mankind's greenhouse gas emissions are mostly responsible for global warming, I just assumed that this advice was to help protect Vice President Gore's political agenda on the subject. But this did not particularly bother me, since I knew that as an employee of an executive branch agency, NASA, my boss ultimately resided in the White House, and to the extent that my work had policy relevance, it seemed entirely appropriate to me that the privilege of working for NASA included a responsibility to abide by direction from my superiors. But when I finally did tire of the limits on my interactions with Congress and the press, I resigned from NASA in 2001 and assumed my present position as a university employee, where I have more freedom to speak on climate issues. Now, secondly, today, and more importantly, I'd like to present some of the latest scientific research regarding the relative roles of mankind and nature in climate change. As you might know, there remains considerable uncertainty over just how sensitive the climate system is to our greenhouse gas emissions. But now we have peer-reviewed and published evidence, both theoretical and observational, that climate sensitivity estimates previously diagnosed from satellite data have been too high. The two papers describing that work are referenced in my written testimony. And furthermore, in recent weeks, I believe we have attained what has been called the holy grail of climate research, which is a true measurement of climate sensitivity. We have discovered why previous sensitivity estimates have been so high and so uncertain. They have been contaminated by natural cloud variability. And we have even developed two methods of removing that contamination. An analysis of 6 years of our latest and most accurate NASA satellite data reveals evidence of very low climate sensitivity. When translated into an estimate of future global warming, it would be less than 1 degree C by 2100, well below the range of the IPCC's estimates of future warming. If this new evidence of low climate sensitivity is indeed true, it also means, and this is very important, if we have low climate sensitivity, that also means that the radiative forcing being caused by the CO2 we've put into the atmosphere is not nearly enough to explain the warming we've seen in the last 100 years. There must be also some sort of natural warming mechanism involved. And this is where the IPCC process has failed us. The IPCC has been almost totally silent on potential natural explanations for global warming. Although they mention a couple of external influences, such as volcanic eruptions and small fluctuations in solar output as possible minor players, but they have totally ignored the 800-pound gorilla in the room: natural, internal, chaotic fluctuations in the climate system. In my written testimony, I show with a simple climate model a simple example of how small cloud variations associated with two known modes of natural climate variability, the El Niño-La Niña phenomenon and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, might explain 70% of the global average warming in the last 100 years, as well as its basic character, the warming that was experienced until 1940, slight cooling or constant temperatures till about the 1970s, and then resumed warming up until recently, since the satellite data shows that warming stopped about 7 years ago. But as Dr. Trenberth mentioned, short-term results are no indication of future potential. Now, while these new results that I'm talking about are not yet published, I did present them in a seminar to about 40 climate researchers at the University of Colorado last week, and I received no serious objections to my analysis. It seems that the IPCC leadership has a history of ignoring natural climate variability. I often wonder what evidence for natural sources of warming might have been found if the same amount of money and manpower was put to the task as the IPCC has used over the years. After all, remember, the IPCC is tasked with dealing with the human influence on climate, so they don't have a whole lot of motivation for finding possible natural explanations. There's a story I'd like to relate to you, and I've never told it before. In the early days of the IPCC, I was visiting the head of the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy, the director, Dr. Robert Watson, who later became the first chairman of the IPCC. He informed me and a work associate with me that since we now had started to regulate ozone-depleting substances under the 1987 Montreal Protocol, the next goal in his mind was to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel burning. This was nearly 20 years ago. There was no mention of the scientific basis for that goal. So as you can see from the beginning of the IPCC process, it has been guided by desired policy outcomes, not science. I believe that most of the scientists involved in the IPCC are indeed reputable and honest, but they have been used by politicians, bureaucrats, and a handful of sympathetic and outspoken scientists. In conclusion, I am predicting today that the theory that mankind is mostly responsible for global warming will slowly fade away in the coming years, as will the warming itself. And I trust you would agree, Madam Chair, that such a result deserves to be greeted with relief. That concludes my testimony, and I'd be willing to answer any questions.
Okay, we're going to, before you start my time, this is the list how I'm going to call on people. After I finish my questions, Senator Craig, then, unless there's an objection, Senators Lautenberg, Cardin, Klobuchar, Whitehouse, and Sanders. Is that acceptable for everybody? Okay. And we're going to give each of us 6 minutes. Mr. Spencer, did you quit NASA when Bill Clinton was president or George Bush was president?
I believe when George Bush was president.
Okay. I also want to point out that on your own blog, you said you never were told you couldn't speak about your scientific views. And I think that's really key, because what we have happening now is the scientific views are being censored. And lastly, I guess it's a certain congratulations, Rush Limbaugh referred to you as the official climatologist of the Rush Limbaugh Excellence in Broadcasting Network.
Yeah, that's a tongue-in-cheek reference.
Right, but I just wanted to point that out for people to understand. You know, we know that Mr. Burnett has been forthcoming about his problems and where he stands, and I just want to make sure everybody knows what's really happening.